I would now like to introduce our next speaker, who is Ossian Smyth. Ossian is the Green Party's TD representing Dún Laoghaire, the Dún Laoghaire constituency in Dáil Éireann. He was first elected to Dún Laoghaire Rathdown County Council in 2014. He was Cathaoirleach, that's a bit of a mouthful for a German, Cathaoirleach of the council from 2018 to 2019. And prior to taking a seat in Dáil Éireann, he worked as a technical project manager in St. Vincent's Hospital. Ossian is the health spokesperson for his party and will talk to us now about the Green Agenda for Financial Services and the draft program for government. Thank you, Ossian.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everybody, and it's my pleasure to be here and talk to you. I'm a member of the Parliament since 4 months ago when we had a general election in February. And at that time, we had a good success for the Green Party. We had 12 TDs elected, and we went into talks. So we've been through a process. I'll just tell you where we are now. We've been through a process of 4 months of talking to other parties. And I guess we were delayed a little bit by the pandemic during it. But we're now at a point where we have agreed. I was on the negotiation team, and I helped to negotiate a deal with the two of the parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and we have to now get that deal ratified by our members. And all 3 parties come back to their members, asking them to say whether they want to go ahead with this and go into a government for the next 4.5 years, bring us up to 2025. So the last week has been, we've been canvassing and trying to persuade our members to support this, to ratify it, and that the counting and the decision will be done on Friday by all 3 parties together. So by Friday evening, we will know whether this deal has been approved. And on Saturday, if it has been approved, there will be a meeting of the Parliament, and we will elect a new Taoiseach to replace Leo Varadkar, probably. So that's kind of the that's the train that we're on. That's the status we're in the moment. And if you're wondering what happens if we don't ratify it, if we don't agree it, not really sure. We'll then be into a kind of a difficult period where people are trying to make governments with other people, or perhaps have a second election, or just be in a situation where we continue on with the existing caretaker government. So that's where we are at the moment. I'll give you a little background on who we are in the Green Party. There are basically 2 kinds of Green parties in Europe, and you can tell what they are by who they affiliate with in the European Parliament. So there are 2 green groups in the European Parliament: the European Green Party and Green Left, Nordic Green Left. So we're in the European Green Party, which means that we're a centrist party, and the other group of the other type of Green Party is a far left Green Party. And a lot of countries have both. We just have one so far. We just have one. So we're the kind of centrist Green Party, and we were set up originally in opposition to capitalism and in opposition to socialism. So to find a third way. And I guess the objection to capitalism that people have in the Green Party is that it's consumerist, that it's extractive, that it has an idea that the more of your resources that you consume and the faster you do, the richer you are. So it's trying to find a way to be prosperous in a way that lasts, sustainable prosperity. That's our goal. And also to do it in a peaceful way. So this is a party that exists all across Europe, and we regularly meet with the other Green parties in the other countries. And I see that the Green Party in Germany, currently the 2nd most popular party, so they've got broad support. And when we look at the Green Party in Germany, we think that's the kind of Green Party we want to be, a Green Party that has that's large and mainstream and appeals to a lot of people and has a possibility to be the largest or the 2nd largest party in a government. So at the moment, we're the 4th largest in Ireland. The 3 top parties sort of came even, pretty much. There's like 3 parties that are much the same size, and then we're there in 4th place. One of our connections with Germany is that our former leader, John Gormley, spent a lot of time in Germany in the 80s, and he saw around him how there was a lot of interest in being umweltfreundlich, and there was that this concepts of environmentalism were more advanced in Germany, and people were getting more involved in things like recycling and renewable energy. So he kind of came home with those ideas, and I think that was part of his motivation. At that time, we had all kinds of policies, like people were trying to speak Esperanto and all kinds of things. Well, we're not doing that anymore. So so I guess we're very strongly pro-European as part of our international thing, and we're pro-European because we see Europe as a place where people can cooperate, that they can stay peaceful together, and that they can achieve a sustainable prosperity with each other. And a lot of that's our general position. So, talking about finance, I think that a big turning point came 5 years ago when Mark Carney warned investors that they could be facing huge losses by investing in fossil fuels. And, he used the phrase stranded assets. And he indicated to people, look, we cannot extract all of the oil and gas that we've discovered so far. If we take it out and burn it all, we'll burn the planet. And so there's no point in looking for more. And he warned people that this was not a good asset class to invest in. And for us, this was really dramatic, because it looked like the mainstream was kind of coming around to our point of view. And sure enough, some investors thought, oh, this is a great time to invest in oil and gas when crazy people are saying that they should divest. But in fact, since then, if you look at the Dow Jones oil and gas index for the last 5 years, it's halved since that time when Mark Carney said that. So if you invested in oil and gas stocks at that time, you've probably lost a lot of money. Ireland wasn't very progressive on this stuff in the last decade under the former Prime Minister Enda Kenny, former Taoiseach. But when he was replaced, Leo Varadkar was more in the kind of mold of, I guess he saw himself as he wanted to be more like Trudeau and Macron, and he wanted to be more progressive. And in 2018, Ireland did divest, for example, from all oil and gas stocks, which was a kind of a turning point. And we also banned oil exploration at that time. It wasn't a big deal to ban oil exploration, because we've been looking for oil for 40 years, never found any. So we were kind of giving up something that probably didn't have a big value. But there was a change, and I think that emissions really hadn't fallen in 15 years at that time. But progress on emissions has happened in the last couple of years, but it takes a few years for them to be reported, and I don't think that the accounting for emissions is slow, and so a little progress was made in the last couple of years. So we've come along. We sat down at the table with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael because they didn't have enough. For the first time in the history of Ireland, in the history of modern Ireland, the last 100 years, you cannot make a government with the top two parties. So the division of votes was fractured, and you needed at least 3 parties to make a government. So we sat down, we talked to all the parties, and we eventually began to negotiate seriously with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And we had, of course, much higher ambition for climate emission reductions than they had. So they had their plans. They wanted to reduce emissions by 30% by 2030, and we wanted to go to 50% or 51%. So this was a lot of the negotiations were about what were the actions we were going to take to get there. It's one thing to set a target. Anybody can set a target. We had a 20% target the last decade, which we completely missed. So setting the target is the easy bit. Coming up with the actions that you need to take to get there is a hard bit. So you're thinking about things like completely changing. Like if you want to ultimately we want to get to net zero by 2050. And that means you have to completely remove all emissions from transport, all emissions from agriculture, all net emissions from agriculture, all emissions from energy production, all emissions from heating homes. So that's a big challenge. Okay, we've got 30 years to get there, but to get to those points, you really have to tackle every sector. So one of the things we agreed is that the Climate Change Act will be passed within the first 100 days of this government, which will set a 5-year budget for climate emission reductions, and each sector will have its own target to make it. So, for example, we are going to retrofit insulation to 500,000 homes. We're going to completely change our transport investment. We're going to, for every euro we put into roads, we put 2 euros into public transport investment. And we're going to spend over the next 5 years 1.8 billion euros on improving walking and cycling infrastructure so that people are doing short journeys, like getting the kids going to school or going to the shop, can be done safely on foot or safely on a bicycle. So those are some of the big changes. I think up to now, a lot of the focus has been on how to reduce emissions in energy, and without thinking of all the other sectors. Agriculture is a particular challenge. Ireland is a country that has not just a financial interest in agriculture, but it's a sort of a social and spiritual interest in agriculture. Farmers want to keep farming regardless of whether they're making money or not, and people have a great affection for agriculture and farming. And really, we have to find a way to help farmers find alternative incomes that don't produce emissions, or ideally, to find ways that the farmers are actually reducing emissions by sinking carbon through forestry, or by rewetting bogs, or finding ways, or renewable energy, so that they're actually having a negative effect on emissions, which can at least offset any methane emissions from their cattle. One of the big one of the strategic things that's going to happen as a result of this government, if it gets approved, is that obviously we have to stop investing heavily in large-scale fossil fuel infrastructure. So we won't be building new coal power plants. That wouldn't make sense. We won't be building liquid natural gas import terminals for fracked gas imported from the US. Now, we're kind of helped because that whole business of shipping fracked gas from the United States to Europe was based on an arbitrage, I guess, that there was a price difference between, it was cheaper to get fracked gas in the US considerably than it was in Europe. Gas prices, as I'm sure you know, are now lower in Europe than they are in America, and the whole business model doesn't make sense anymore, and it's expected that there will be very few LNG investments over the next decade in the US, if any. Of course, it's hard to know, but we're certainly, that's one of our major demands, was that we don't that the state doesn't subsidize LNG import, because it was on the European projects of common interest list, so we're going to remove it from that list. And secondly, the government is going to put out a policy statement saying that it is opposed to the importation of fracked liquid natural gas, and this will make it very difficult to get planning permission for any of these facilities. And I suggest to you, if you're an investor, not to invest in large-scale fossil fuel infrastructure in Ireland, because people like me, we're making sure that you don't make any money out of it. Okay, so we've had a big pandemic, same as everywhere else in the world, and that had I guess that had the effect of people changing their behavior very suddenly, and it gave people, I guess it gave people a view that it was possible to have great changes in society very quickly, that people would comply with government rules, and that massive, large-scale government intervention could be effective. It also told people that prevention in disease terms is better than cure. So we've had that experience, and the reason, I guess, that people changed their behavior so radically and so quickly was to protect their older relatives, to keep them safe. And really, we'll be asking people the same thing with climate change. We'll be asking them to change their behavior radically, but this time to protect their children and their grandchildren. So that's our future for the next 5 years. There is a huge change in the approach to dealing with recessions. So, 10 years ago, we had a major recession in Ireland, which was deeper than it was across the rest of Europe. And we were compelled, I guess, by our lenders of last resort to implement very strict austerity measures, a lot of additional taxes, and a lot of cutbacks in spending. And because I guess the pandemic is affecting all countries in Europe, and I guess given the experience of the austerity of 10 years ago as a means of tackling a recession, I think there's been a change of opinion that this time around we are going to try a more Keynesian approach with more government investment, more borrowing, and attempt to grow our way out of this crash rather than to cut our way out. And we're very keen in this program for government in the Green Party that the investments that do happen, the large-scale public investments, are good for the environment, that they are green investments, that we have a green recovery and not a brown recovery. So we will be hoping that our government is not going to try and invest in things that like motorways and bailing out airlines and giving people money to buy new fossil fuel cars. And we'll be hoping that the investment goes into electric vehicles, into putting solar panels on people's houses, into insulating homes, and really just transforming our society into a much greener one. And I think that the European Green Deal is going to set a policy framework for Europe on this. And I think that it will be easier for us to persuade people to go along these lines when we can say that other countries are following much the same route. One of the changes we're making is to change our procurement framework. So we have an Office of Government Procurement in Ireland, and they set all the rules for how the country buys things and how we do our purchasing. And we are changing to a green procurement framework, which will greatly alter how we go about buying things. And lastly, the carbon budgets that are coming into place, the sectoral targets, they will really determine how our investments happen strategically in Ireland for the next few years. So if we are considering large national development projects, or if we are considering how we are going to authorize or license or regulate for different types of infrastructure, we will of course have to have regard to what our national carbon targets are. And if they don't align, then we can't do them. So I guess that from an investor's point of view, you really want to look at what the legislative framework is and realize that low carbon and sustainable investment is really the only option at this stage, or the one that's going to make money. That the other ones will be squeezed out, and it will be harder and harder to be involved in fossil fuel or old school investment. Okay, there you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ossian. Again, I hope you can hear me. There I am. Thank you so much. Now, we're a bit behind time, so I jump straight into the question and answers section of our webinar today. I have a few questions here, and maybe Ossian, since you're in full flow, I can start with you. There was one question that says, what will your party, i.e. the Green Party, do to support the financial services sector in Ireland?
Okay, so I guess the financial services sector in Ireland is huge. It represents a lot of employment and a lot of investment, and in general, it can be a low carbon operation. A lot of people are working from home. It doesn't involve massive extraction, and it doesn't involve a lot of use of raw materials. We have a large regulated financial services sector here, and we have a special, they're right in the center of the city, and we will be supporting it. And of course, we're very pro-European, so we'll be looking at it from the point of view of, from a regulatory cooperative point of view. And I guess we're facing now the problems with Brexit, and there's going to be a lot of work to be done dealing with how we manage the change in regulatory arrangements with London. So clearly, a lot of business would have been going through London before, and I guess we will be competing for that business in future.
Thank you very much, Werner, and for the kind introduction. I will just also mention that it was my pleasure in the early 1990s to be a member of both ECO, which was an environmental awareness promoting organization, and also to be treasurer of Youth Environment Europe, and to be a supporter of the Natural Step Foundation, which a quarter of a century ago pioneered a lot of the thinking from Sweden about the rate at which we extract resources from the Earth's crust and the rate at which the Earth can absorb those extracted resources. So it's a great pleasure. Werner has mentioned a couple of the things I've done since then, but I just thought that I'd mention that because I found all of the presentations absolutely fascinating, and what a wealth and detail of contribution we had. It's not possible in 5 minutes to capture that wealth, but let's try and get the highlights. So if Helen will kindly bring me to the next slide. First of all, we had Stephen Nolan, Managing Director of UN Environmental Programme Financial Centres for Stability. And Stephen and I are old sparring partners from our work on Brexit. And I think Stephen made a number of excellent points. He pointed to the rapid increase, 390 plus pieces of legislation and regulation at pan-European level. And with sustainable finance now moving from somewhere in the back row to very much the front row in terms of its role in economic recovery. He points to the emerging world-class cluster of Irish expertise and how well we are positioned to carve out a lead in Europe. No other country is as closely identified with the colour green as Ireland. So I guess from a branding point of view, we have an excellent opportunity. He also spoke about the EU recovery package unveiled on the 27th of May, a significant size, 750 billion, a new recovery and resilience fund of 560 billion. And he mentioned the 40 billion that's going to be available to help those affected, those sectors affected by the green agenda to adjust. He mentioned a vision for Ireland, which is very enticing, that we can leverage our green brand and our expertise to become a top tier location under the Ireland for Finance banner. Let me mention also that I was the first government appointed secretary to what was then called the IFS 2020 process, which was started in 2015. And that was to grow the international financial services sector. That's now called Ireland for Finance. And we have seen 10,000 jobs created in the last 5 years. So there's a very exciting potential for growth in that area. So we might now move to Elsa's contribution, the next slide. Equally fascinating and equally detailed. Elsa spoke about Barclays being the first bank of its scale and size that has committed to net zero by 2050. And although she made that point at the end of her presentation, I think it's very much worth bringing it up to the top to kind of underline everything she said. And she talked about not just aligning lending priorities, but also the bank's actions in capital markets as well. So very much a cohesive approach. She spoke very strongly about the need to bring out the S in ESG even more than before. And I suppose that has both a social dimension, but I would suggest, I hope she wouldn't disagree with my interpretation, it also means being mindful of those who have been negatively affected by the crisis and ensuring that the green agenda is consistent with their needs to join the recovery as soon as possible. She did caution about the regulatory environment. It's a big lever for ESG and banks. I guess a question is to be careful that the regulatory agenda is consistent with a smooth transition, and I suppose as much buy-in as possible from the financial services community. I hope, Elsa, I got you wrong, or I got you right. Let me know if I got you wrong, and I'll correct that. And I think also the standardization of ESG reporting was a very important point. So we can talk about the big broad themes of green finance, but Elsa pointed to very important work that's being done to enable the financial services sector to benchmark its own performance in relation to peers and to derive more accurate and specific measurements indicators. And then a final point that she made was making sure that CO2 activities across the supply chain are as green as possible. So it's not just about an overall score of financial sustainability, but that a particular product is mindful of the consistency and cohesion of sustainability across the supply chain of the activity, that it's not great in some areas of the supply chain and bad in others. I hope, again, that reflects what, Elsa, you were trying to get across. And lastly, but not least, we came to Ossian's very, very interesting presentation, talk about having somebody who's right there at the coalface of government formation. It was a great privilege that Ossian joined us at this very busy time. His key points were that we can look forward on Friday and Saturday to a Saturday we'll see hopefully the election of a Taoiseach. He mentioned Germany having the second largest Green Party, the largest Green Party in Europe, but it's the second most popular party, and that the Green Party in Ireland is aiming for that broad acceptability. And he spoke about climate neutrality and the size of that agenda and the need to promote cohesion and he referred to the sectoral budgets that will be in the programme for government, and also the importance of ensuring that large-scale environmental projects are carbon efficient, climate friendly, and I think he issued a warning, a very strong warning, in relation to investments relating to fracked liquid natural gas. We might move on to the next slide, if we can. So now let me say, in conclusion, a few words about the Financial Services Committee, very capably chaired by Werner Schranberg, but we should also mention other leading members. We have Declan Bulger of Irish Life, we have Tyke Young of State Street, we have Jasper Hannegut, and we have Simon Dauber, all of them excellent. Simon Dauber of Allianz, and Jasper Hannegut indeed of Barclays. And a few points I think to add to the excellent speakers we have had so far is, I think that the points from the committee we received are that the financial and real sectors will need to work together. The financial and real sectors of the economy will need to work together. We will need to balance the social and the environmental goals of ESG, a point that I think Elsa made herself. And the government will drive the incentives and the framework for industry. And the prospect of a government with such a strong green influence makes Ireland a very good location in that regard. And then finally, echoing the point that was made about the consistency of green investment with the continuation of cross-border trade, something that the German Chamber of Commerce is very much involved in, as not just a German organization, but an international one. Wrapping quickly up, what does the Financial Services Committee do? Well, it plays a very active role in ensuring that your voice is heard by Irish, German, and EU legislators. It promotes open, competitive, and fair financial services across Europe. It champions cross-border financial services between Ireland and Germany. It advises on opportunities. It provides you with guidance at firm level if you want to operate in both markets. The committee meets 4 times annually at least. Guests have included ministers for finance, ministers for state, for financial services, members of the EU Parliament and Monetary Affairs Committee, prestigious and distinguished members of the Bundestag like Dr. Joachim Pfeiffer. It's active in Berlin, Frankfurt, Brussels, and it aims to help the government deliver the Ireland Finance Initiative. And at the bottom of that slide, which will be up on the Chamber's website, you will see a link to that initiative, and hopefully that initiative will be renewed under the next government. And I think we have maybe 2 more slides. We might go to the next one. So we have a forthcoming meeting on the 28th of August with Dr. Joachim Pfeiffer. He's a member of the Bundestag and CDU spokesperson on economy, and I think he epitomizes the kind of international access that the Chamber offers to its members. On the 9th of September, we hope to have the Central Bank of Ireland Chief Economist, Dr. Mark Cassidy. That is to be confirmed. So we just put a little bracket around that, but it's not there yet, but it should be, but hopefully will be confirmed. And then in October, the next meeting in September, October of this committee will happen with a focus on financial services and Brexit negotiations. And any further information you wish on the activities, you can contact me via Helen Dunn at German Irish Chamber. And I think we have one more slide. So we really would like to make your agenda our agenda. Tell us what your top priorities are for financial services representation and advocacy. Help us make your voice heard in Dublin, Berlin, Frankfurt, and Brussels. Let us integrate your ideas and agendas into what we do. We would be delighted to meet you on an individual basis to bring your briefings and concerns and make them part of our own activities, as I said, in Berlin, Brussels, and Frankfurt, and Dublin. Again, to find out more or to make suggestions, please contact me via Helen Dunn at germanirish.ie. And I don't think we have any more slides, Helen, do we? I think that's it, so I think I can...
For Barclays. In this role, Elsa leads strategic direction and execution of the bank's policies and practices regarding climate change, sustainability, human rights, and social innovation. She oversees ESG assessment and approach for the firm. ensuring that diverse stakeholder views are integrated into decision-making, and strengthening client and investor engagement. I could go on, but I won't, and hand over to Elsa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Werner, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Really lovely to be with you all. I think you'll find that a lot of what I have to say actually echoes what Stephen shared. He set the stage really well for the few things that I would like to share this morning. I'd start out, I just have a couple of slides, but this first one, it's worth noting that just straight off the bat that Barclay's investment in ESG has been widespread and deep at the same time. And one of those indicators is that we have actually grown our ESG research capabilities. And so these themes that you see on the first slide have come from our research team thinking about themes for 2020 regarding ESG in the banking sector in particular. And you can find more on our website, more detail regarding these themes. I'm just going to pick up on a few of them, but certainly happy to answer more should there be questions. I think, you know, again, starting out with our present circumstances and situation globally at the moment, given that I think there was, as Stephen mentioned, there was a expectation perhaps that COVID would bring ESG issues to a screeching halt. And in fact, we've seen that that actually isn't the case. I think there's some firms for whom they've had to put ESG on the back burner, but indeed, we've seen actually these issues grow ever more important and ever more in the center of focus, because fundamentally the things that were most challenging to society and to the environment prior to COVID-19 have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. I think it's tempting, certainly sitting here in London, to think that the beautiful air quality we're experiencing at the moment is a sign of the type of climatic or environmental regeneration that's happening world over. But in fact, if we look at the totality of global markets and geographies, we're seeing that in fact that's not actually true all the time. That in the breakdown of governance and oversight that's happened in some geographies, we've actually seen mass deforestation in some areas because there's no one there to oversee and ensure that folks are abiding by the laws. And the economic devastation that's happening already has driven people to increase their economic destruction. So we do need to be thinking about the totality of the global system, and indeed both the environmental and social aspects related to the economic well-being of these systems. I think, you know, related to that, and as we see ESG issues come ever more into focus, I would pick up again on a theme that Stephen mentioned, which is that I think we can expect to see the S in ESG receive far more attention in the months and years ahead. As I mentioned, I think that not only is it because the livelihoods and economic opportunity of vast numbers of communities worldwide are being threatened, but indeed, you know, it's the most marginalized and most disenfranchised communities that have already been the ones to see the worst of climate change, who are now going to be hit with this double whammy of also being most profoundly impacted by the economic downturn and recession we're seeing coming out of COVID, hopefully, as we all emerge from COVID. This is a very different circumstance from what we saw, obviously, in 2008, where the financial institutions were actually the ones who bore the greatest brunt or sort of saw the most impact because it was a financial crisis. In this case, because of the nature of the economic crisis, we actually see financial institutions in a position to really be the stewards of care and growth for our communities and for global markets. And so banks in particular are positioned to be stewards of these ESG trends and to make sure that we're building a just and sustainable future. And so again, I echo here what Stephen said about the need and really, frankly, the obligation of all of us to be thinking about how we build sustainability and ESG imperative into the economic recovery plan. I would mention, a couple of things. If you look at the dark boxes on this slide, these are the ones that I'm going to pick up on, and certainly could talk in great detail about every one of these trends. And for a matter of time, I'll just jump around a little bit. But I'd pick up again on something that Stephen mentioned around the regulatory environment. I think we've seen this, certainly in the UK, have a dramatic impact on the banks in particular, and our ESG activity, as the Bank of England has encouraged banks to do stress testing and scenario analysis to look at the financial impacts of climate change in particular on our books. It's awakened the banking community, and I think indeed sort of starting to regenerate the entire financial community to take into account the very real financial impacts of climate change across the board. And then you blend with that, obviously, the societal obligations that we all have to make sure that not only are we accounting for the impacts on the banks or the financial systems, but indeed making sure that we're not exacerbating further the challenge of climate change or indeed other ESG issues. And I'll get into this a little bit more when I talk about Barclay's position. A couple of challenges or things to keep in mind that I think banks in particular are facing right now. You'll see number 6, I note standardization of ESG reporting. This is one of those issues that can seem somewhat banal at first, but actually is pretty profound when you think about what it means for the banks. I think we continue to face many of the same issues that you probably all have heard other representatives of banks and financial institutions talk about, namely the access to appropriate data to be able to actually measure our materiality, our exposure to both climate and other ESG issues. And then very importantly, the standardization of ESG reporting and how critical that will be as we move forward into this next phase of ESG accountability. I think fundamentally we're seeing a huge proliferation of numbers of platforms and reporting mechanisms. And that's great in the sense that it really reflects the momentum of these issues in the market. The challenge is that means that depending on the frameworks and tools that one is using for ESG reporting, you might not see parity or harmonization across the market, which makes it really hard, not only for the investors, but even for the banks themselves to assess their performance and their activity relative to their peers and relative to the total market. There's been a couple of efforts underway. The World Economic Forum in particular has been working on a program to harmonize ESG reporting. They have the big 4 accounting firms behind them, and that indicates a sign of progress and promise should we be able to actually really work on harmonizing this reporting. We see now also the some really sort of active physical tools available to us, with microarrays of satellites being launched so that there's quite literally eyes in the sky to take a look at what companies are doing on the ground. If there's methane leaks coming from oil extraction sites, or if there's forest fires or active burning happening, deforestation to clear land for agriculture or what have you. I think fundamentally we're starting to see that these capabilities are yielding more and more accurate and more sort of specific data points, which then banks need to take into account in our chain of custody and what we're responsible for. Related to that, I think, and related to this sense of responsibility, number 7, there's this idea of look at reduction in carbon dioxide emissions across supply chains. So this is no longer just about a company's immediate operational footprint, but really thinking about the full value chain and both upstream and downstream elements. And for example, if you're a manufacturing company, thinking about all of the inputs that go into the products that you are producing, and then indeed what the chain of custody of those elements are as they move down the value chain. This is important to banks as we think about our own exposure. And so fundamentally, we're creating this chain of custody that we all have to think about. It's one thing to think about this when it comes to carbon and thinking about climate change, and that's already complex enough. But as we see this rise in ESG issues and the focus on S that I mentioned earlier, we're also starting to talk about things like human rights. and care for livelihoods and communities. And that means that, again, the expansiveness of our exposure to these issues and the point at which we are all become responsible is growing and becoming ever more clear. And so it's just enhancing the necessity for us to pay more attention and to be really, really clear and understand exactly what's going on throughout that entire supply chain, both for, in our case, our clients and their companies and their chain of custody, but also indeed for banks, looking at the totality of our client operations. So that gives a whistle-stop tour of a few snapshots of what's happening for banks on a meta scale. And I'd say that everything that Stephen mentioned is the macro environment in which we're working, and this real need to think about economic growth as completely inextricably tied to ESG issues, thinking about climate change, thinking about human rights and livelihoods and community engagement, and thinking about good governance of those issues. And that really leads into Barclay's own position then, where we've been able to go. And so, Helen, if I could trouble you to move to the second slide, please. This is just a quick snapshot of a pretty ambitious position that Barclay's put out just at the beginning of April. We've been on quite a journey internally to be thinking about our role in climate change in particular. I think that's been sort of the #1 issue for banks in the last year and a half or so, and it will continue to be important, but then, as I mentioned before, we'll have to overlay and make sure we're paying as much attention to the S issues as we are to the E issues. We, as I mentioned, have been on quite a journey and engaged with a huge number of stakeholders to be thinking about how Barclays could take a more meaningful step forward. I think I can say with candor that Barclays was a bit behind in terms of our efforts to be thinking about how and for what are we responsible when it comes to climate change, and how we might be positioning ourselves in a more proactive way. And so over the course of the last year, through engagement with our board of directors and our executive management team, thinking about how we could actually embed climate change imperative into our strategy, we've come up with this plan. So first and foremost, I'd actually focus on #2 on this list, which is we have made a commitment to align the entirety of our portfolio to the goals and timelines of the Paris Agreement. We're going to start with our energy and power portfolios because those are, first of all, most material to Barclays, but also most carbon intensive. So it makes sense to start with the biggest and most challenging buckets first and then move on. But the important thing is we are indeed going to move on to other carbon intensive sectors after that, things like manufacturing and transportation, agriculture, et cetera. And there's been a lot of good work done on this front by other European banks, I should note. And so, by no means are we venturing into this alone. It's important to know that we are picking up on all the good progress that's been made, both by our peers in the industry and also by a lot of good entities who are trying to think about these measurement mechanisms. And that's where I'll note that I think in the case of Barclays, the reason why this is so important, and frankly why it's a big deal, is because it's not just about a lending portfolio. That is, of course, a very important mechanism, and we're looking at that. But in a large diversified business such as Barclays, we also have a huge number of capital markets transactions to take into account. And so we're looking at the totality of our financing and not just our lending when we think about this exposure and measuring our portfolio and indeed aligning it to Paris. So this is a huge undertaking. We've brought on board a few partners to help us think this through. And as I mentioned, I think the desire here is to build a system that will work for a bank the size and scale of Barclays, but we want to continue to work with our peers and with the community of practice who's been at this for quite some time to be thinking about how to better measure and how to better align the portfolio. It's important that we started with that because that is, of course, the thing that's within our complete control and our domain in terms of our ability to adjust and adapt that portfolio. But it's also really critical to think about what this looks like in the real economy. And for that reason, we felt it was important to overlay an ambition to be a net zero bank by 2050. We are actually the first bank of our scale and size of our kind to make this ambition clear. And for that, we're very proud, but also recognize that there's a huge amount of work that will go into making this a reality, that fundamentally we're taking into account all of our direct and indirect emissions for the businesses we finance around the world. And then again, in all sectors by 2050. This aligns with many country governments' objectives, certainly the UK government, but obviously taking into account all of the ambition of the EU as well, and thinking about how we can be supportive of those efforts to reach a net zero state, hopefully, preferably well before 2050, but giving ourselves that deadline. Again, we have huge measurement challenges here, and it's going to be a massive undertaking to think through exactly what this means for a bank like Barclays and what then in turn that means for the global economic community. But we felt like it was really important to overlay that goal on top of our own portfolio alignment. I will say that we've made some very specific restrictions around certain sensitive energy sectors. Again, this is a first step into understanding that, you know, that's a paradigm that is deeply exposed to great carbon intensity, and also it happens to be a big portfolio for Barclays. So it's important that we put some clearer and more concise restrictions around issues like coal and financing in the Arctic. And the Canadian oil sands, as well as looking at fracking. I won't go through those in detail. You can see them on the slide, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions about the detail of that. But I'd say that the most important premise behind all of this, and the reason why we really undertook this position, is that it was important that we think about our playing an active role and an active stewardship role in the transition to a low carbon economy. If we think about the role of banks in particular within the wider financial system, and then within the wider economic system, fundamentally, we are the conduits of this activity. And so if we can steward the flow of finance in a very particular kind of way and be mindful and active stewards of that transition, then we can help the whole economy to move in a really thoughtful way. So fundamentally, that has to do with obviously limiting the exposure to brown and then growing exposure to green. And I think this gets it into, again, what Stephen was talking about in terms of the Green New Deal and opportunities to really lean into green growth and green economic revitalization. And so we felt like it was important to make sure that we were making that really, really clear. And we have increased our commitment to green finance in particular to £100 billion by 2030. And we're in the midst of working out exactly what will feed into that goal, but making sure that, that our standards for that green financing and what we count are indeed consistent with what our peers are doing in the European and UK context. And making sure that we are upholding really high standards when it comes to the integrity of what we count as green, because naturally that's going to be important to grow that space in the financial sector as well. So in totality, this all amounts to some pretty significant moves, and we're really excited and also really very aware of how much work we have to do and looking forward to continuing on that journey. But I think that, you know, given the context of COVID-19, I'd say that has not slowed us down. Indeed, it's probably brought much more into focus the meta picture in which we're working, and the fact that this is all only moving in one direction. So I'll stop there, but certainly happy to answer questions, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
As Werner said, my name is Stephen Nolan. I'm co-director of the UN Environment Inquiry into the Design of Sustainable Financial System. And as he also said, a co-founder of Sustainable Nation Ireland that works to position Ireland as a leader in the area of sustainable finance. Next slide, please. Great. So I'll just give you a quick sense before we get into an update on what's happening within the green recovery at a European side. Financial Centres for Sustainability, where did that come from? As I said, the UN Environment Inquiry into the Design of a Sustainable Financial System, established in 2014 to explore how the rules of the game in finance, in terms of policy, reg and market practice, could be aligned with sustainable development. A lot of work happened, over 120 reports, secretary to the G7 and G20 Green and Sustainable Finance Task Force. So a lot of work the inquiry has done and actually underpinned the establishment, for example, of the central bank's network for greening the financial system. Two entities that have come out in the inquiry is the Financial Centres for Sustainability and the Sustainable Insurance Forum. The Sustainable Insurance Forum, of which the Central Bank of Ireland is a member of, is 31 insurance regulators around the world working on this topic. And as Werner said, FC4S is a collective of 30 members across 4 continents. Members account for just over 61 trillion in equity market cap and represent 80% of global equity markets. Dublin is a founding member of UN FC4S, and indeed, with the support of EU Climate Kick, hosts the FC4S European node in Dublin. So a lot of things going on within this. And what's super is that actually I'm at this point now overseeing both FC4S and the Sustainable Insurance Forum. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I said, Dublin is a founding member of the FC4S, set up at the end of 2018, but Frankfurt is also a founding member. And what's super there is the Frankfurt Green and Sustainable Finance Hub represents Germany as a member of the UN FC4S network. And very, very great and delighted to see the focus in Germany, and no surprise, on the topic of sustainable finance. Very much bank-centered with both public, private and cooperative banks in the main in Germany. And as I said, great to have Frankfurt as a partner there. The federal government in Germany last year established the Sustainable Finance Committee, of which our member is a member of. And I think I'm personally quite excited about Germany's taking over the EU presidency next week, because I believe sustainable finance is a priority of theirs as they work on the EU presidency for the next 6 months. And in particular, as we emerge from COVID and into the recovery, which I'll talk about shortly. Next slide, please. The FC4S model of engagement, just very quickly, is effectively, as I was stated earlier on, we are working to accelerate the accelerators in the 30 financial centres to further integrate the sustainable finance agenda into everything they do within those centres. And as we all know on the call today, financial centres are an ecosystem of different actors across public policy, regulators in the central bank or insurance, academia, research, banks, insurance, private equity, stock exchange. There's a lot going on within a financial centre, hence the reason why we created a unique network for them at the request of the G7. So we do a lot with those centres to promote and assist them with their strategy. But effectively, if you look at the right-hand side, what are we trying to do? We are trying to bring all the centres on a journey in terms of a sustainable finance scale, with level 5 achieving total alignment with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. No financial centre is there right now. There are no FC4S members at level 0 with little or no awareness. Most of the FC4S members are at level 1, where they're aware of the need for sustainable finance with early stage fragmented activities. Level 2, the centres are evolving, starting to develop expertise in some areas. Level 3 is getting strategic. You're seeing Paris, you're seeing Frankfurt, you're seeing Tokyo, you're seeing Hong Kong, you're seeing London, Luxembourg and others, and Dublin is in that stage as well. So that's where the FC4S works. And as I said, it's a network established at the request of the G7 within the UN to accelerate the accelerators of financial centres. Dublin is proud to be a founding member and also very proud to host a European node. Next slide, please. Okay, so just going into global policy activities update. If you give the next slide as well, please. Thank you, Helen. So one of the things that Helen, the guys, asked me to look at was what is happening at a policy level around sustainable finance globally, then into Europe, then into Ireland. So I just wanted, before I got into detail, in particular around Europe, I just wanted to give a sense of what's actually happening globally at a policy and reg level in sustainable finance. Launched during the Madrid COP last November, December by ourselves, we created the first comprehensive global database of policy and reg measures on sustainable finance, legislation, policy reforms, reg instruments, guidance, and coalitions. We categorized this by asset class, objectives, instruments, implementation, and geographic criteria. And what does this database, the first database of its kind, do? It enables key stakeholders, if you're a policymaker, regulator, or market actor, to access examples of policy approaches applied in other jurisdictions. So that's about sharing best practice. And I think one of the key things in the climate action agenda that we are faced with, we don't have a lot of time. So why reinvent the wheel, whereas other jurisdictions may have done something quite innovative or quite simple in unlocking private sector capital or public capital towards climate action agenda. So the reason why we developed this database was to allow key stakeholders to very quickly find out what were good approaches globally, and then also create a network where people could actually, maybe not on the database itself, but people could pick up the phone or an email to somebody and say what went wrong with a specific policy, and share those not just best practice all the time, but things that sometimes went wrong. And again, can if you know about them, can short circuit what you're trying to do in your own jurisdiction. If you go to the next slide, please. I think what this slide shows, thank you, Helen, is again on the back of the database. It's always good to see some infographics. But what we've seen in the database we developed and launched last year, since 2015, there has been a 106% growth in policy and regulatory measures in green and sustainable finance globally. So that's quite a dramatic increase over a relatively short period of time. And what that is, it's exactly 391 policy and regulatory measures for a sustainable financial system worldwide. So again, quite a significant number. This database only goes up to January, and I imagine if we were to update it now, which we are in the process, you would actually see some further new policies and reg measures in the process of emerging. But I think the key thing to show there in the context of discussing sustainable finance today, while there's a lot happening in the private sector, and Barclay and Elsa will give us an example of that, on the public and regulatory side, there's also a huge amount of activity going on. 391 new measures, 106% growth over the last, since 2015 is quite significant. And it highlights that at a policy and reg level, globally, regionally and nationally, the policymakers and regulators are really trying to push and create a new playing field for the private sector actors to work together on the climate action agenda. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, if I do go back to the database, breakdown by asset classes and those new 391 policy and reg measures, 13% related to the insurance sector, 16% related to the banking, and investment was 47%, with multiple cutting across several different topics, 24%. What does this actually show us when you look at that database at the policy and reg side is that the progress towards a sustainable financial system has picked up significant speed in the last number of years, and where we see 264 of those policies were in the developing countries, with 127 in developing and emerging economies. From my perspective, sorry, if you go on to the next slide, please. So what does that mean for a European perspective for the green, just and resilient recovery? Next slide, please. Thank you, Helen. So I suppose if you take the context of the policy and regulatory and the growth in policy and regulatory measures over the last 5 years, now at 391, 106% increase. Pre-COVID, what did that show? It showed that there was a significant move into the whole policy and regulatory environment to support climate action, and then the broader environmental and social governance agenda. When COVID first hit, I think part of the concern was that the sustainable finance agenda had really, in the last number of years, moved very forward rapidly, and that was on the back of quite a bullish market globally. Whereas if you saw the 2008 financial crisis, the sustainable finance and the green finance, or even general sustainability, carbon, climate agenda, really stalled after the 2008 financial crisis and took a while to pick back up. So I think some of the concern when we came into the COVID tragedy was, well, actually, will now the sustainable finance agenda, will it stop? Will it slow down? Given, as I said, 391 policy and reg actions, it was moving at a dramatic speed. In the early days, again, the markets were quite fluid. It was focused on saving lives. A lot of capital coming out from government to keep economies propped up, to keep people employed as much as they can. There wasn't a focus on the green agenda per se, and that's just natural, and that makes perfect sense given we were effectively in a life and death situation. What we're seeing now is that, in particular led by the European Union, is that COVID-19 revealed that there's insufficient integration of sustainability considerations into our economic systems. So even though there have been nearly 400 policy and reg measures put in place in previous years, they felt there was a need to go further and that the COVID tragedy and what COVID highlighted to us again was that we needed to do more around the sustainability considerations in our economic system. And also what COVID also highlighted is a lot of the focus, a lot of the policy measures over the previous years were focused on the E, or the environmental piece of ESG. But I think, you know, we're all watching telly, we're all watching what was happening around the world. The highlight of, if you did not have healthcare in certain jurisdictions, and not just around COVID in general, the inequality of that system. So the S, that social piece, really came to the fore and has come to the fore during this whole COVID tragedy. And that is something that we're also seeing now talked about a lot more. ESG. From a governance perspective, big firms, those governance models worked. The majority of those firms were quickly able to move staff to working offline. Helen, I'm going to turn off my camera because my internet connection. Okay, so a lot of the banks and insurance and asset managers were able to move online, underpinning that they had good governance models in place. I think one of the key things now, as you look, as I said, into the future, into a green recovery, the sense is that the green recovery and what we do should be at the heart, or sorry, the green agenda should be at the heart of our economic recovery. So starting with Europe, as I said earlier on, highlighting the insufficient integration of the climate agenda into our economic system, biodiversity, soil, human activity, climate change, environmental integration. And I think the key thing, what the Commissioner is saying, is that a green recovery now is indispensable in terms of as we move forward. Next slide, please. So what does this actually mean in reality is we've all, if you've been tracking this agenda over the last few weeks, you know, the EU Green Deal is now seen as a motor for the recovery of the European economy. We've seen the President of the European Commission come out and say it needs to be at the heart as we rebuild the Green Deal. There should be no trade-off between incentivizing the speed of the economic recovery and supporting the sustainability agenda. And if I go down to the next part, is that sustainable finance is going to be at the core of this strategy, of this recovery. And if I look at the middle box there, sustainable finance provides instruments that should be used to align public and private finance towards a green recovery. So if I stay with that statement for a moment, the key thing to recognize, and a lot of the participants on this call today are from obviously financial services, is that it's going to cost money obviously to recover, but the climate action agenda was also costing many tens of trillions. Europe as well within that. No European Union, no government of China, wherever the jurisdiction, no government on its own can afford or has the finances to finance their own national decarbonisation, even at a regional level. So the key thing there, and the key thing at the heart of recovery, is that role of sustainable finance and how we can develop instruments or upgrade existing instruments to align public and private finance to crowd in together towards this green recovery. So the key thing here now, as we look at the Commission, is how can we get private capital on top of public capital to co-finance this shift towards a green recovery. Next slide, please. So if we look at the recovery package itself, adopted on 27th of May, it's quite significant in terms of the figures. They're eye-watering. A new recovery and resilience facility of 560 billion, a just transition fund of up to 40 billion. And that's really important in the context of what we're discussing today and the new programme for government. You know, we are seeing in the Midlands, in particular in Ireland, you know, industries that before were high, you know, employed high numbers of individuals are now being phased out. And from a just transition perspective, while there will be winners and losers in the climate action agenda, we need to ensure that we just don't jump into who has lost jobs and how can those jobs be replaced. So this is why just transition and the team of just transition is really important. So it was fantastic to see a 40 billion euro fund to assist member states as they transition to a low carbon economy. A lot happening within that, but the key thing is that real capital has been put on the table to allow member states to try and get a chunk of that capital to support their own national decarbonisation efforts. Next slide, please. So again, you know, if we look, as I said, go back to earlier on, the whole role of private capital, there are tens of trillions required to decarbonize the global economy. Europe itself needs X number of trillions. Ireland needs just in around 100 billion, I believe. But this capital needs to come from somewhere. It's not philanthropic capital. It's not corporate social responsibility. It's private capital that needs to see a return, and a good return. And I think one of the key things, if you look at what the Commission has come out with in terms of the Green Deal, this obviously is a recovery package. It's not a rescue package per se. The new Green Deal obviously can support the creation of new jobs, but fundamentally at the heart of what the EU is trying to do is underpin a future growth strategy. And the Green Deal, if you look at it from its full potential, is essential to the future competitiveness of Europe. And I did a conference with the Commission last year, and I just highlighted when I was speaking, remember the Nokia phones, remember the Ericsson phones. At one point, Europe led in mobile technology, and we've lost that leadership. Right now, Europe is leading in the area of sustainable finance. And from our perspective, sustainable finance and the transition to a low carbon economy, but the broader ESG is where the market will be at for the next 10, 15 years. And if Europe can get that legislation or regulatory environment and framework in place, you as private sector actors can really, really within that framework, develop new products and services and get capital out the door. So fundamentally, that's about competitiveness. And then also, if Europe can get its act together in terms of what the Commission is trying to do and build on what the Commission has done already, why can't we export those solutions around this world as well? Why can't we assist in the finance and decarbonisation in Africa, for example? So a lot going on within that. I'm just going to move very quickly to within Ireland. So if you can go down a few slides, please. Keep going down. The second last slide, please, Helen. And Helen will share these slides afterwards. Stop, please. So just very briefly, what does this mean for Ireland? So fundamentally, at a global level, there's a surge around the ESG sustainable finance agenda. People thought when COVID hit that it may stop. The opposite has actually happened. If you then bring that down to a European level, at a regional level, as I just pointed out, the new Green Deal is at the heart of the European recovery. Sustainable finance is at the heart of that. Helen will share these slides with you afterwards, but that's what the slides above we're talking about. If you look at that from an Irish perspective, the Ireland for Finance strategy outlines Ireland wants to become a top-tier location of choice for financial services. Sustainable finance is a horizontal priority of the strategy, and Ireland is rapidly emerging as a leader in the area of sustainable finance. Last slide, please, Helen. Or next slide, please, which is the last slide. What does this mean for programme for government? And Ossian will talk about this later on. If you look at the programme for government, the objective is to contribute positively towards a wider global response, shaping the post-COVID recovery, and how we lead as an exemplar in decarbonising our economy. The Ireland for Finance strategy is highlighted, as is the area of sustainable finance in the programme for government. I won't get into details of the actual programme. That's up to Ossian, as he was one of the authors of it, and he can speak way better to me than that. But the key and the final point is the delivery and the execution of that programme for government is going to cost a lot of money. We have never been in a time where there's so much private capital globally. At the heart of the recovery, not just in Europe and Ireland, as stated in this document, is going to be our green transition. And I think what the government, and in the document, what the government has already done is creating a framework to allow private capital to operate in this space and to crowd in with government money to fund the delivery of the programme for government. That's me finished. Thank you, Helen.